Welcome to the George Thomas Clark podcast. Today, it's my pleasure to return the favor and host Warren Rogan, who has graciously 3 times hosted me on his very popular podcast, Sports Forgotten Heroes. I talked one time about the old mongoose, Archie Moore, the Knockout King, Jerry Quarry, probably the best, one of the best fighters who never won the heavyweight championship, and also Teofilio Stevenson, the great Cuban 3-time Olympic heavyweight boxing championship and owner of the most explosive right hand in history. So thank you for letting me talk about those people, Warren, and we want to find out more about you and your career. So welcome to my show.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor.
Warren, one thing that we never had any chance to talk about because we were so focused on the aforementioned personalities was a little bit about your background. I've been reading about you online, and I see that, before the show, as we were doing a little sound tech testing, you said that you're from Westchester County, New York, which is a very upscale area. Tell us a little bit about that. It must be pretty nice up there.
Yeah, that's where I grew up. I currently live down in Orlando, Florida. My house, it shakes every night when the fireworks go off. Obviously right now, no fireworks, but when Disney is up and running, my house shakes every night from the fireworks. I grew up in Westchester County in a town called Ossining, and Ossining is actually a pretty famous place. It's the home to Sing Sing Prison along the Hudson River, and when you watch a movie and they say they're going to send you to the big house or they're going to send you up the river, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about Sing Sing Prison. And, that's the town I grew up in, although you would never see Sing Sing unless you search for it. And it's about 25 miles north of New York City, and it's a great area. It's some of the most beautiful country there is in our country.
Yeah, and Ossining is also famous as the longtime home of the great short story writer and novelist John Cheever. Did you know about Cheever when you were a kid growing up?
I didn't, but I have heard that, and there's a great actor from Ossining as well, Peter Falk.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, he was a superb actor. Cheever passed away in the early 80s, so he's been gone a long time. He died at age 70. He was an alcoholic, but he got sober, but he still continued smoking, and I think that weakened his overall system. Falk lasted much longer and was a dynamite actor. Now, I see that did you go to college in New York?
No, as a matter of fact, I went to a school in Ohio. It's now known as Ashland University, and my major was in radio and television. I've always loved production. I've loved radio work and television work. My high school, Ossining High School, had a radio station. I used to call the football games, did the morning sports report. And when I went away to college, I had a dream of someday being a sports announcer. Didn't quite work out that way, but I have remained connected to sports in one way, shape, or form. Worked as a newspaper writer for Gannett Suburban newspapers in their sports section, mostly covering golf. And from there, I went on to work at an all-sports television network long before ESPN News. There was something called Sports News Network, and I worked there for a year before it went under. And then I went back to Gannett and found myself later on at the Golf Channel as a senior producer. I produced most of the golf instructional content. Then I ended up at NHL Productions just before the NHL had its lockout. And I came back down to Florida, where I currently do a lot of work for a local production company called Go Convergence. And, we produce commercials, corporate videos, documentaries, the works, all over the world. And it's a very exciting place to work. And I'm very thankful that I have such a job.
Well, I can imagine that. Documentaries are generally a very high quality product. In other words, it's better than just the news. Better than just a podcast, for that matter, because it's a movie. That's what a documentary is. It's a movie. What are some of the subjects that you guys have covered?
Well, mostly for me, I don't want to talk about what other people have done, but I think recently the two biggest things that I did, documentary style, they weren't full-blown documentaries. I did a lot of work for Smuckers on how they make their products, literally traveled around the world to see how they make coffee, how they make their peanut butter, apple juice, of course, their fruit spreads, cake dough. It's really interesting work. Those movies, we call them movies, were probably about, in the range of 8 minutes apiece and very detail-oriented. They were produced at a very specific resolution, and they were played in their innovation center for potential customers so they could see the quality of just how good Smucker product is. And another one was the Permian Basin down in Texas. In Midland, Texas, there's a museum called the Petroleum Museum, the Permian Basin Petroleum Museum, and it basically traces the history of the petroleum industry in that area of the country, and they redid all of their content, and we were engaged to produce all of that. So I learned a great deal about the petroleum industry, how you drill, how you frack, reservoir management, different products that are made with petroleum, who the movers and shakers in the industry were and are. Really a fascinating subject. And then, of course, I've done some sports documentary work at Convergence or Go Convergence as well. Mostly, namely Ben Hogan being the most recent, and that was, several years back.
So obviously, like me, you've had an interest in sports since your childhood, and you were able, years later, after being a sports writer, which is something else I did. I was a sports correspondent in California years ago. And what prompted you to start Sports Forgotten Heroes? That's an interesting concept. People who were, for the most part, stars in their days, or at least well-known, depending on the individuals, but who are now largely forgotten, particularly by the young people. What prompted your interest in that?
I've always had this interest in sports, and I have a great library of sports books. I mean, hundreds of books about sports, and it's just a topic, first of all, that I'm very passionate about, and I read a ton of different sports books and subscribe to so many different sports magazines, or at least I used to. It's a different time now. And, I was talking with somebody and said, I'd really like to put together a podcast. I don't know about what. And we were talking about it. They were drilling me down all the way down to what interests you. And I was telling them about my passion for sports. And I said, but, I don't know if anybody else really cares about some of the guys that I would like to talk about. And the guy told me, he said, listen, Warren, if you have an interest in that particular subject matter, it is guaranteed that there are other people out there that have the same interest. So start a podcast and see what you get. And that's what I did. I procrastinated for about a year, and then I finally said, you know what, I'm just going to do this. And my hope was that I would publish my first podcast, and outside of my brother and my friend and the person I interviewed about the subject, that's 3 people there. I was hoping I'd get, at least another 3 or 4 people to listen. And, the first podcast I did, I don't know, I got 20, 30 people to listen. I was like, hey, you know what? Maybe there is something here. And now, I have a pretty darn good loyal following. Several hundred, 700, 800, 900 people listen to a podcast, sometimes over 1,000. It's just now it's a passion project, and I just enjoy talking to people like you. I've had the opportunity to talk to a couple of great athletes whom time has forgotten. And I think there's an audience, everybody can talk about Babe Ruth and Jim Brown and Wilt Chamberlain and Wayne Gretzky, but not everybody remembers Pierre Palat or Lefty O'Doul or, Billy Cannon and Bill Barilko and Dave DeBusschere even. Andy Pafko, a subject that'll be coming up very shortly. There are these guys, and some of them have the most fascinating stories, and these stories are buried because no one remembers who these people are. And so I thought, let's document it. Let's make a podcast. And the way I've been told, once it's out there forever.
Yeah, it is. And speaking of many of the names you've just mentioned, I've got a list of 7 or 8 people here, and they're people who you have done podcasts about. Let's talk a little bit about them. One
Sure.
that was not long ago was the great 6'6" shooting guard Drazen Petrovic from the former Yugoslavia, who came to the NBA and after an adjustment period of a couple of years became one of the top shooters and scorers in the league, had built himself up into roughly a 20-point scorer, and then he was killed in a car accident in Europe.
It's a really tragic story. When I first decided to do Sports Forgotten Heroes, I just started writing out names of people who I remember, and who I thought would make for a good topic for Sports Forgotten Heroes, and Drazen was one of them. And earlier this, back in the fall of 2019, I decided it's time to do a story about Drazen. And the ironic thing is, I had reached out to someone about doing a podcast on Drazen Petrovic, and shortly thereafter was when, Kobe Bryant, his tragedy occurred. So there was really no coincidence in the fact that I was doing Drazen because of Kobe. It was just a matter of timing, very, unfortunate timing. But Drazen is such a great story. And I remember when he played for the Nets, and actually when I worked for Sports News Network, I was assigned the NBA Finals between the Pistons and the Blazers, and Drazen was on the Blazers at that time. So I actually saw him play in person, quite some time ago. And, this guy had a passion for basketball. I'm currently watching The Last Dance, the Michael Jordan documentary on ESPN.
Yes.
And obviously, Michael had a crazy passion for basketball. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Drazen's passion for the game was as strong as Michael's, but darn it, if it wasn't close, This guy, every waking second, would practice his game. And he made up drills. He would go into an empty arena and set up obstacles to dribble around them, to jump over them, to move around them. He would shoot from all angles and everywhere you can imagine from the on the basketball court. And he turned himself into a phenomenal player. One of the crazy things about Drazen was the fact that as a young child, he actually had to wear leg braces. He had some issues with walking, and when he got out of those braces, all he wanted to do was play basketball. His parents signed him up for music lessons. They wanted him to be a guitar player, and he would loosen the strings before every lesson and make sure that guitar was out of tune. So the first half hour of his lesson, his instructor would have to retune his guitar, and Drazen would run out of the house and shoot baskets until he had to get back in there because the guitar was back in tune. He just had this crazy passion for the game. And when he was 14 or 15 years old, he was playing in adult leagues over in Yugoslavia, obviously later Croatia, and he played on their national teams, and he played in the Olympics. And he was discovered by Digger Phelps, and Digger wanted him to go to Notre Dame, but for whatever reason, he didn't go to Notre Dame. But in international competition, Chuck Daly also took a liking to him, and ultimately he and Chuck ended up on the net.
I'm from Bowling Green, Kentucky, so the name Darrell Carrier jumped out. I only lived there as a kid, but I would spend the summers back there with my father, and I followed the Western Kentucky University program. For those who don't know, basketball is a passion in Kentucky, and including in Western Kentucky, and which is in Bowling Green has about 30, now maybe 50,000 people. Darrell Carrier in the early 60s played for Coach Ed Diddle, a legendary coach there. How in the heck did you get hooked up with Darrell Carrier?
Well, Darrell, I mean, what a shooter that guy was. So part of what I do in my podcast as Sports Forgotten Heroes, once in a while I will concentrate on a team that people might have forgotten or just don't know about. I've done shows on the Kansas City Scouts, who were an NHL team, and I did a show on the Kentucky Colonels of the old ABA. And one of the great players on the Kentucky Colonels was Darrell Carrier. The guy could just flat out shoot. He could hit it from downtown unlike anybody else, with maybe the exception of his backcourt partner, Louis Dampier. Louis played, I think he's one of three, maybe four, it's either 3 or 4 players that played every year of the existence of the ABA. So he played for the Colonels all 9 seasons that the ABA existed, and he wound up with the San Antonio Spurs afterwards. But Darrell played for, I don't know, it was like 4 or 5 years for the Colonels. And in my research about the Colonels, I learned a great deal about Darrell. And
a bomber, I checked him out on YouTube, saw a YouTube interview, and he's now in his early 80s, living in the Bowling Green, Kentucky area. And he said when he would put on shooting clinics and exhibitions, he would almost always hit 90% beyond the arc, which is really quite accurate.
Yeah, he was this incredible shooter. He was also a homebody. He didn't want to go away. He was recruited by Kentucky, but he opted to stay at Western Kentucky. And then he was drafted, I think it was by the St. Louis Hawks, but he was not drafted highly, and he was not guaranteed a spot in their starting lineup. So instead of going to St. Louis, he wound up playing with the Phillips 66ers, which was one of the all-time great amateur basketball teams. They played in one of those corporate leagues. And ultimately, when he found out the ABA was coming about, he got a tryout with the Colonels, and he couldn't turn down playing close to home. So he went and he played for the Kentucky Colonels. And, he was getting up there in age. He wasn't in his early 20s anymore. He was in his late 20s, early 30s is when he played for the Colonels. And he, I think, has the highest field goal percentage from three-point land than anybody else in the history of the ABA.
Yeah, I think he does. Yeah,
he was just this terrific interview. He was a lot of fun to talk to. I hunted him down. I think when I finally got a hold of him, he was actually in his car with his wife. They had just finished shopping at a Walmart or something, or a Home Depot or something like that. And he said, yeah, sure, I'll talk to you. And I called him up, and I interviewed him for about an hour. It was a lot of fun. It was a great way to celebrate the 75th episode of Sports Forgotten Heroes with a forgotten hero. Most of the people I talk about have long since passed, but every once in a while I get the actual forgotten hero on.
Well, I'll tell you one guy who is still with us physically, although sadly he now has Alzheimer's, is Joe Kapp. And you mentioned excitement. Joe Kapp was a very exciting leader throughout his career. He wasn't a great passer at Cal, but the last time the University of California Bears went to the Rose Bowl, Joe Kapp was their quarterback. Then he went to the Canadian Football League. He led the Vancouver team to the Grey Cup championship, and then subsequently was the quarterback of the Minnesota Vikings when they went to the Super Bowl, the only quarterback in history to lead teams to the Rose Bowl, the Grey Cup, and the Super Bowl. And I was watching YouTube a few years ago, and this was in reference to a 2011 incident. Joe Kapp had a beef with a fellow who took out his star running back. This was in a Grey Cup game in 1963. And Joe Kapp took a flower and waved it at the guy and the guy said, "Hey, stick it up your ass." And Kapp went over and started slapping him with the flower. The guy got up and he was crippled. And he tried to hit Kapp with his crutch, and Kapp stepped into him with a right cross, decked him, and then kicked him a couple of times. And these are two 73-year-old men. And old Kapp was moving quite well, but sadly he does have Alzheimer's. So you can probably add even some more information about Joe Kapp.
Yeah, Joe was, I didn't get to speak with Joe. I interviewed somebody about Joe. One of the organizations that I'm a member of is the Professional Football Researchers Association. And I get to meet a lot of people through it, as well as SABR, the Society for American Baseball Research. And I count on a lot of people to, to help me out through those two organizations. They're great organizations. And I found someone to talk to about Joe Kapp. And like you said, Joe went to Cal, and then he wound up in the Canadian Football League, where he had a terrific career. And then he ended up in Minnesota with the Vikings. And he was a terrific quarterback, and he won the NFL championship with the Vikings in 1969. Remember, this is before the Super Bowl.
Right. We have to. No, it wasn't. They had the Super Bowl.
The Super Bowl, but you had the AFL champion and the NFL champion.
Now, today we would call that NFC, AFC. So, yes, technically they called it the NFL championship, but it was really, by today's standards, the NFC championship, and they were beaten by the, I believe it was the Vikings.
He played for the Vikings.
Excuse me. They were beaten by the Kansas City Chiefs.
Kansas City Chiefs. Correct. That was, this was just the 50th anniversary of that victory, that the Chiefs pulled off this past year against the 49ers. But Joe in 69, he had a great season. He played in 13 games, went 12-1, and led the Vikings into the championship against the Chiefs. Unfortunately, they didn't win, but he was as tough as nails, if I recall. And then the Vikings went out and they got themselves a guy by the name of Fran Tarkenton, and Joe ended up on the Patriots, the Boston Patriots, and didn't do too well and disappeared. I mean, he had a very short NFL career.
Yeah, just 3 or maybe 4 years. Actually, yeah. I think Fran Tarkenton preceded Joe in Minnesota, and then Kapp replaced Tarkenton.
Right.
And I think Tarkenton went to the Giants.
He did.
But, he was a leader and above all, he was a leader. He didn't have a good passing arm, but I can remember in a playoff game, and I double-checked it just to make sure my memory was correct. It was a playoff game. They were playing the Cleveland Browns, and the Browns had a Pro Bowl linebacker named Jim Houston, a 240-pounder, a guy big enough to play today. And Kapp broke through the defensive line and into the secondary, and there's Jim Houston squared up, ready to put the linebacker hit on him. Instead of trying to dodge him, Kapp threw his body at the guy. And as it turned out, Kapp's knee caught him on the chin, and it knocked Jim Houston cold there on national TV. And I thought, man, that Kapp is a tough hombre. And that was his style. But as sometimes is the case, the guys who are the toughest as players, and we saw this with the great tight end John Mackey, used to destroy defensive backs, but they are the guys who have very often the traumatic brain injuries later in life.
Mm-hmm. One of the other interesting stories about Kapp is he was actually part of a trade between the CFL and the NFL. So he was actually traded from the BC Lions to the Vikings, and the Vikings traded a guy by the name of Jim Young back to BC. It's one of there have been like 2 or 3 trades between teams where they traded these contracts, and so I don't know what all the different semantics are to making a trade between 2 different leagues, but it actually it occurred. That's how he wound up with the Vikings. And I mean, he had a terrific career in the Canadian Football League. I believe his numbers retired by the BC Lions. He won like you said, a CFL championship. He was an all-star. The guy was he was a really good quarterback who wound up playing in the CFL instead of the NFL. He was drafted by the Redskins, but never played for Washington.
Right, and as you mentioned, he did have a short career, 3 years with the Vikings, and then 1 year, and he was battling for free agency. He was one of the early pioneers in that respect, and he ended up losing. Actually, they got people, including Don Shula, to come into court and to testify, well, Joe Kapp's just an average quarterback. Well, his results weren't average. And one reason I'm very clear on this, I just read Kapp's autobiography, and we should say, quote-unquote, autobiography. It's got about 5 authors, including a son and friends and attorneys and so forth. And it's worth reading. It's very informational. But anyway, Joe, for a few years now, has had Alzheimer's disease and is not well, but he's had a great life. And now another person that's on your list is Dave DeBusschere, who to some of your fans is probably a little better known than others. He was one of the few guys who ever played Major League Baseball and Major League NBA basketball. He was a pitcher briefly for the Chicago White Sox, 6'6", very strong guy, very tough and physical. And I last remember him well back in the day of 1985 when Patrick Ewing was the prize in the draft. And DeBusschere, as the GM, the general manager, was representing the Knicks on national TV. David Stern was there on all of this. They drew if they were drawing balls at the time, they drew the number. The Knicks got it, and I can remember a very nervous Dave DeBusschere celebrated. It was quite a relief that the team got Patrick Ewing, who, of course, went on to a great career with the Knicks.
So, the reason I did the story on DeBusschere, and there's a couple other two sports stars that I've done shows on, and I usually like to try and cover the career for which they're least known. And DeBusschere, most people remember him as a great basketball player. He actually started off with the Pistons, and at the age of, 23 or 24 years old, he was so good, he was named their player coach.
Right.
But the Pistons were just not this good team, and he was the only marketable player on the team. So the Pistons wound up trading him to the Knicks, where, he really excelled and helped them win a couple of championships. Later on, he became commissioner of the ABA and was one of the driving forces during the merger. But what I mostly concentrated on was the fact that he was a good baseball player, and he actually played parts of 2 years with the Chicago White Sox. The first year was 62, and he appeared in, a dozen games or so. But in 63, he appeared in, he started 10 games, went 3-4, had a 3.09 ERA. I mean, he was a decent pitcher, and the Pistons didn't like the fact that he was playing baseball for the White Sox, and part of the way that they got him to give up his baseball career was to name him coach of the team, so he would have to spend more time concentrating on basketball as opposed to playing baseball. And the fact that he was a really good basketball player as opposed to an okay baseball player is also part of the reason why he ultimately strictly concentrated on basketball. But the guy was a good baseball player.
Yeah, he was good. Anyone in the major leagues is automatically good. I saw DeBusschere play many times on TV when he played with the Knicks, and he was a very physical player. He was known for his tough defense. He was a good rebounder. By the standards of the day, he was a solid shooter, and he was part of that great Knicks team that had the backcourt of Walt Frazier and Earl Monroe, Willis Reed as the center, and Bill Bradley, the Rhodes Scholar and future senator, as the other forward opposite DeBusschere. And
they had Jerry Lucas, too, who was just this outstanding, basketball player. I mean, that team was so good, and, to think of where they are today is just, it's disgusting.
Well, that was their last championship. They won the championship in 1970 and 1973, and they made a couple of other finals during that period. So they haven't won a championship in 47 years now.
Correct. Yeah, they are just not a good team. But there have been a couple other. I'm trying to remember. I've done so many shows. I'm 80-something shows now. Trying to remember. I had another baseball player / basketball player, and he played for the Celtics, and he played for the Tigers. And gosh darn, if his name isn't escaping me right now, but I did a show about him, and he won a couple of NBA titles with the Celtics. I'm embarrassed. I've done so many. I've done so many shows.
That's all right. A name slipped me. I want to slide this back in. the big defensive lineman who Joe Kapp had the feud with back in 1963 and whom he decked in 2011 was Angelo Mosca, who was a legendary defensive lineman in the Canadian Football League. He went on to be a wrestler, a professional wrestler. So that's the kind of competition. Although we should say that the gentleman was crippled and on crutches, but he attempted to whack Kapp with the crutch. That was so Angelo Mosca on that one. Now, another guy I wanted to talk to you about is Oscar Charleston, who on your website it says the best ever to play in the Negro Leagues. I would have to say, Warren, what about Josh Gibson?
Yes. So first of all, the player I'm thinking of was Gene Conley. Gene Conley, he pitched for the Milwaukee Braves in 1957, and he won championships with the Celtics. Say he's the only player ever to win a championship in two different leagues.
Okay, yeah, I've read about him recently, and I had forgotten that. Right, he was a backup on those some of those early great Celtics teams. Now, again, Oscar Charleston, I have no doubt that he was good, but the best ever with Josh Gibson?
So I believe it was Bill James, who, is the father of sabermetrics, one of the greatest baseball researchers. Well, the author of a book by the name of Jeremy Beer, he wrote a book called Oscar Charleston, The Life and Legend of Baseball's Greatest Forgotten Hero. Jeremy is a baseball junkie and was going through some lists, and he kept coming across the name Oscar Charleston. And he's like, how can I be such a huge baseball fan and see a list of the 10 greatest ball players of all time as ranked by some of baseball's greatest statisticians and not know who this guy is? So he did a little research, and in one of those lists, I believe it's Bill James, and I apologize if I got that wrong, lists Oscar as the fourth greatest ball player of all time. Or maybe it was even the third. No, the fourth greatest ball player of all time. And he's like, who is this guy? And they ranked him as the greatest player in the history of the Negro Leagues. And he played before Josh Gibson. He played before Satchel Paige. He played when, the Negro Leagues, keeping stats and, finding statistics from the Negro Leagues is virtually impossible. Anything of real concrete seasonal statistics, it got better towards the end of the league, the league's existence. But during the early days, there wasn't a whole lot of record keeping. They said this guy routinely hit balls over 500 feet. His play in the outfield was second to none. And you talk to all these experts about Negro League baseball, they will tell you that Oscar Charleston was the greatest player in the history of the Negro Leagues. And he played, he got bored with the game. So towards the end of his career, he would just pinch hit, and he was twice the size of what he was when he first started, when he was 16 years old. And he would get off the bench, get a base hit, and then be pinch ran for. But they said his defense was just ridiculous. He had an arm, you couldn't run on him. He, back then, your mitt was the size of your hand. If you had a mitt, he'd catch the ball over the fence. He would challenge hitting 400 every year. And teams, wherever he went, his teams won.
Well, yeah, it's certainly a racial injustice, as well as a sports tragedy that great athletes like Oscar Charleston, Josh Gibson, Cool Papa Bell, and some of the Satchel Paige in his prime, that they didn't get a chance to play in the major leagues because they undoubtedly would have been overwhelming stars.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Another fellow I wanted to talk to you about is Blanton Collier. And that name's very familiar to me because my first favorite football player, and of course over a lifetime one has a number of favorites in every sport, but my first was Jim Brown. And Paul Brown, for whom the Browns were named, had a great run for the Cleveland Browns, but he was fired after the 1962 season. They brought in Blanton Collier in 1963, and in 1964, and still one of the most legendary games in NFL history, at least among, say, baby boomers, was the 64 championship game. And this was the real NFL championship because the AFL at the time was not really up to the NFL standards. And the favored Baltimore Colts, led by Johnny Unitas, Big Jim Parker, the lineman, Raymond Berry, Lenny Moore, the great running back, a terrific team, played Jim Brown and the Cleveland Browns. And the mathematician quarterback, Frank Ryan, of the Browns, threw 3 touchdown passes to Gary Collins. Brown rushed for about 120 yards. And the Browns not only won, they beat the Colts 27-0. And Blanton Collier was that coach, as you no doubt know.
Yeah, interestingly enough, I also did a podcast on Frank Ryan, and I had Frank as a guest. And he might be the smartest guy to ever play in the NFL. I mean, the guy was brilliant. And in fact, he built or designed the back end of the computer system that's used in Congress. I mean, the guy was just when he went to the Redskins after his career with the Browns was over, Vince Lombardi acquired him because of how smart he was, and he just wanted to lean on Frank for his football acumen and his computer skills, because Vince wanted to bring that into the game of football. Blanton Collier coached at Kentucky before he moved on to the Browns. And, yeah, he was an assistant under Paul Brown. And I guess Paul Brown had worn out his welcome in Cleveland. They brought in Collier. One of the most interesting things about Blanton Collier, first of all, he was a player's coach. The players loved Blanton Collier. But he was hard of hearing. And he had to basically have lip readers near him to help him, discern what people were saying. And he always had people in the office with him who'd be listening on the phone, again, to tell him what people were saying. He was a terrific coach, the last coach to lead the Cleveland Browns to an NFL championship. And the guy was a great X's and O's coach. And, what can you say? Blanton Collier was just this terrific, overlooked coach who had a great career.
Yeah, absolutely. I was checking his record yesterday. He had 7 straight winning seasons with the Browns. This is when they only played 14 games. And he had 10. He averaged about 10 wins a season because he had 69 wins in 7 years. So he was winning 10 out of 14 games over a 7-year period. Then his final year, he was 7-7, and so really an outstanding coach.
Yep.
Now, another greatest backup in history here is Earl Morrall, and I will have to let you define it. But when I think of some of the great backups in history, let's remember future Hall of Famer Steve Young was a backup for 4 years for Joe Montana. And Aaron Rodgers was a backup for Brett Favre. Do you mean someone who was a backup most of his career or much of his career?
Yeah, I mean, Earl ran into great difficulty in this. Every team he went to play for had a super-studded quarterback. But the guy would come off the bench when called upon, and he'd just flat-out win. In '68 with the Baltimore Colts, here's a team that is it's Johnny Unitas's team. Unitas goes down to start the season, and this guy goes 13-1 to help them, win make it as far as they did in the NFL into the championship game. The guy, he led the league in touchdowns. He was a backup quarterback. He led the league in touchdowns that year with 26. He threw for almost 3,000 yards, which you just didn't do back then. The guy was a real gunslinger. And then
he was a star or a starting caliber quarterback for sure.
No doubt it. And then, he's up there in age. Is 70. I think it was 1971 was his last year with the Colts. Again, Unitas is hurt. He goes 7-2, and at the end of the year, the Colts release him. Don Shula needs a backup quarterback in Miami. He remembers Earl from his days in Baltimore. Shula was the coach, and he says, Earl, why don't you come on over here and back up Bob Greasy? Greasy gets hurt. This is in the famous 17-0 season, and what a lot of people don't know is that Earl Morrall, the Dolphins went 14-0, won their 3 playoff games to go 17-0, right? They won the divisional game, the conference championship, and the Super Bowl. Earl Morrall went 9-0 that year. He won 9 of those games. The guy, again, was just a terrific backup quarterback. And when I went through and did the research on him and talked to different people, you were saying Steve Young. Steve Young ultimately became a starter. But when you look at a career backup, a guy who, when he was with the Giants, he was named starter. That was for one season. It is the only time in Earl Morrall's career that he was named starting quarterback, the number 1 quarterback. Then he got replaced by Fran Tarkenton. He was always a backup. The guy's got numbers that are crazy good. I'm looking at him right now. He threw for almost 21,000 yards. He threw for 161 touchdowns. His career record is 63-36. He's been a part of NFL championship teams, Super Bowl championship teams. So when you are talking about an actual backup quarterback, I don't see how you could say there might be guys that were as good, but better. That's a pretty tall statement. The guy was just this crazy good backup quarterback who fit virtually any system, could adjust his game, and go out and win. And man, did he win. 13-1, 9-0 for the Dolphins in 72.
Yeah, well, there's no doubt. He was a very fine player. And
he was a Pro Bowler. He was a Pro Bowler as a backup.
I remember him also for his crew cut, which was by then unusual in the latter part of his career. People had longer hair, like Broadway Joe Namath and that group. Although Johnny Unitas had a crew cut as well.
Yeah. Hey, I got to mention one other guy. He was one of the first topics that I covered, and to me is one of the most fascinating stories in the history of sports. And it's a hockey player, a guy by the name of Bill Barilko. And the first ever episode I did of Sports Forgotten Heroes was a 2-parter on Billy Cannon. And then I did a 2-parter on Bill Barilko. I don't know if you're familiar with Bill or not, but his story is one of the most fascinating stories in the history of sports. And Bill was a defenseman for the Toronto Maple Leafs. And he was as rugged as they come. And the Maple Leafs had some injury issues, and so they called up Barilko in the middle of the 46-47 season, and he becomes this star of the team and helps lead the Maple Leafs to the Stanley Cup championship in 46-47. Now he's a fixture in their lineup the following year, and the Maple Leafs win the Stanley Cup again. In 49, he leads them to their third straight Stanley Cup championship. They didn't make it to the finals in 50, but they won it again in 1951. So 4 out of his first 5 years, he wins the Stanley Cup. Following the 51 Stanley Cup in the offseason, Bill Barilko goes on a fishing trip with a dentist by the name of Henry Hudson, who is a direct descendant of the Henry Hudson, as in the Hudson River that runs through New York. They go on this fishing trip in deep Canada, and they're never seen or heard from again. The plane that they were on disappeared. Search parties for years can't find them. The Maple Leafs going basically in the tank after this. They don't win another Stanley Cup. So here they've won 4 out of 5 Stanley Cups. And in 1967, the Maple Leafs win the Stanley Cup. They've obviously, at this point, nobody thinks about Bill Barilko looking for, the plane wreck or whatever. They win the Stanley Cup. Wouldn't you know it, shortly after they win the Cup, somebody sees something shining in the deep forest of Canada. Somewhere's in Canada, somewhere's, I think, up in Ontario. They send a search party, and it was the plane. And they found the skeletal remains of the dentist and Bill Barilko still strapped into their seats. So they win a Stanley Cup. He disappears. They win the Stanley Cup again so many years later, and they discover his skeletal remains. It's a fact.
He was very much associated with championships, not only in life but from the hereafter, it seems.
Yeah, he was. It's a truly just this fascinating story, and I can't believe there's actually not a movie about it.
Now, Warren, we want to make sure that your fans and our listeners know roughly how many podcasts you do a week or a month, and when will your next podcast appear?
Yeah, sure. So I release a new podcast every other Tuesday. I've been at it since April of 2017. Due to the unfortunate times that we're in and a couple little obstacles I had to overcome, I was on a hiatus for a couple of weeks. But the last podcast I did was back in April, and my guest was Skip Lockwood, the former Major League reliever, and it was a terrific show. Took a couple weeks off. The next podcast will be released on May the 26th, and that will be about the great outfielder Andy Pafko, who played for so many years with the Cubs, spent a year and a half with the Dodgers. Perhaps with the Dodgers was his most famous moment. He was the left fielder that watched the ball sail over his head as Bobby Thompson was rounding the bases, the shot heard around the world for the Giants. And then I have a show 2 weeks after that about the Baltimore Stallions, who played in the CFL during the couple years that the CFL had managed to find its way into the U.S., and the Stallions actually won the Grey Cup in 1995. And then I have a show coming up on the toy cannon, Jimmy Wynn, and I got another show coming up on Larry Doby. So back at it, a little, I took a couple weeks off, and as we're all getting back to life as whatever the new normal be, the podcast is back, and hoping everybody listens and enjoys it.
Well, I think everyone's going to be delighted because we need sports in our lives. Historical sports are great, and we need some live sports as well, so we'll have history in the making. In fact, that used to be the San Francisco Giants warm-up song back in the heyday of Willie Mays, Willie McCovey, Cepeda. History's in the making at Candlestick Park. And so we would like to thank you for bringing us some history that we wouldn't otherwise have been privy to, and hope to talk to you sometime soon as a returning guest on this show, and perhaps as a returning guest on your show as well.
Anytime, Tom. I really appreciate it. You've been a great guest on my program. I hope I did well for you, and you're a terrific interviewer, and I really enjoyed our hour together.
All right, Warren. Thank you very much.